Yes.
Yes, great. So as you can infer from the title, I am going to talk about grammatical gender, which is a feature that is difficult to acquire for second language learners. And this is the reason why we try to understand how this feature is represented in our mind and how it is processed, okay? So we are focusing in one specific factor that we think that influence the way grammatical gender is represented, and which is the language transparency. That is how gender can be inferred from the form of the nouns of a given language. So first of all, I would like to start with a brief introduction, the state of the art, then how grammatical gender was typically assessed in the labs from an experimental point of view, then the results that have been found in literature and which are inconsistent because they depend on the language that is spoken by the participants. And in an attempt to understand and to account for the inconsistent results, we develop a new theoretical proposal that is called Gender Acquisition and Processing, with the acronym GAP, and which can be incorporated within the structure of the classical models of language production. And if I have time, I would like to talk also about a new approach that we are developing in order to standardize and to pay attention on which factors are relevant when we try to assess the degree of transparency of a given language. And then some questions about future directions in this topic and so on. So what is grammatical gender? As you probably know, as you know also, that languages, there are a lot of languages that have a gender system, and if they have a gender system, they have grammatical gender, right? And grammatical gender is an abstract lexicosyntactic feature of nouns that is realized outside the noun itself through agreement. When I say that is realized outside the noun itself, I mean that this feature can become visible when we look at the relationships between the noun and the other elements that go with the noun in the speech, the article, adjective, and so on. So imagine, for example, in European Portuguese, it has a gender system, and nouns can be divided into or classified into feminine or masculine nouns. So, for example, house in European Portuguese is casa, is a feminine noun, and the elements that go with the noun in a sentences, for example, the article and the adjective, also has to be feminine. So to say the red house, we have to say a casa vermella. But if the noun is masculine, like carro, which is car, then the article changes to the masculine form, and the inflection in the adjective also changes to the masculine form, o carro vermelho. And we also say that grammatical gender is an abstract lexicosyntactic feature, right? And it's an abstract lexicosyntactic feature because it has nothing to do with intentions of the speakers. Casa in Portuguese is feminine because most of the speakers decided that this noun is feminine, okay? There is no semantic relationship to the form of this noun and the gender, okay? And this differentiates grammatical gender for a natural gender, that it has a semantic basis because it depends on the intention of the speaker. If they want to refer to a female or a male, for example, to say boy and girl in European Portuguese, you have to say menino and menina. You have to use the inflection for gender, okay? This doesn't happen with grammatical gender, and we are interested in study grammatical gender differentiating from natural gender. And the main function, of course, of grammatical gender is the establishment of agreement between the elements of the speech, and this is crucially to a good production of language and comprehension. But because it has these components, it has a syntactic component because its function is the establishment of agreement, also has a lexical component because gender is within the lemma level, as we can say. So it's reflected in other words, and it is a property of nouns. And our research focus mainly in this aspect or in this characteristic of the grammatical gender, okay, as a property that is inherent to the nouns. Also, we study the syntactic component, but we focus on this one. So let me go. So when we try to understand how grammatical gender is processed, our research mainly focus on these two questions: how is represented in the mind of monolinguals and also in bilinguals, and how do we retrieve the gender of a noun. And before starting and presenting my research on this topic, I would like to say that the classical models of language production, as you probably know, the Weaver++ model developed by Levelt and colleagues, or the interactive network model developed by Karamatz et al., consider that gender are represented in the morphosyntactic level, which is between the conceptual level, where the information related to meaning are stored, and the morphophonological level, no? The information regarding the form of the speech. So they consider that grammatical gender is represented at the lemma level. If we look at the tenets of the Weber++ model, the model also considers that is represented in the form of gender nodes, masculine and feminine in the case of European Portuguese, neuter and common in the case of Dutch, for example, in this morphosyntactic level. But there is a difference between these two models. According the level model, gender is receive activation, okay, the flow of activation between the levels. There is an interdependence between the meaning level and the other two levels. So when a gender node is activated, a given noun is presented, receive activation, the gender node corresponding to this noun is activated, but only selected if the level of activation surpass an absolute activation threshold, okay? And according to the model, this threshold is only surpassed when the grammatical gender fulfills its main function, that is the establishment of agreement between the elements of the speech. So experimentally, grammatical gender effects also only can be observed if we ask participants to say a noun phrase, for example, a sentence, an utterance in which they have to establish the agreement between the different elements. If they have to produce a verb noun, no effects of gender could be observed. In the case of the interactive network model, they say that this morphosyntactic level is independent from the other two. So we can express and produce some utterances without the necessity of activated gender. So grammatical gender can be observed in some effects of grammatical gender can be observed in some cases and in others not. It depends on, for example, if there is an agreement between elements of the speech or not. The mechanisms that they assume underlying grammatical gender are different from the Weber++. Gender effects are observed because there is a facilitation and mechanisms of facilitation, spreading of activation. But for the IN model, for Karamaz and colleagues, they consider that gender effects occur because there is a competition between gender nodes. And further, later on, we are going to explain the difference about these mechanisms postulated by the models, okay? So how grammatical gender was assessed experimentally? Most of researchers use this paradigm, the picture-word interference paradigm. In this paradigm, participants are presented with a point of execution for 500 milliseconds. Then usually a picture is presented and participants have to say the noun of the picture, okay? But curiously, the picture has in the middle a written word that can be from the same gender than the noun of the picture or from a different gender. So the idea is that if gender is activated, if grammatical gender is activated, then the responses of participants would be or would vary as a function of the condition. If the distractor and the target word share the same gender, responses would be faster in comparison with the condition in which the name of the target and the gender of the target and the gender of the distractor are different. And indeed, this was what was observed. Are you listening to me well?
Yes, we are listening. There's someone with the sound.
Okay, right. So this was what was found in literature. The majority of studies show a gender congruence effect, that is, faster responses for congruent conditions in comparison to incongruent conditions. But the question here is, what kind of instructions researchers gave to the participants? In some cases, an agreement context was necessary to do the task. So participants have to do noun phrases, for example, an article and the noun, a casa, the house, okay? In other cases, researchers ask participants to say bare nouns, only the noun. And the effects seem to vary depending on the instructions. So I'm going to say the results that were observed as a function of the instructions and as a function also of language characteristics, okay? But mainly the idea is that when they have to produce the name of the picture using a noun phrase or a pronoun, the gender of the target noun is activated, but also the name of the distractor. And this causes interference between them, given and leading to the gender congruence effect. And the underlying mechanisms can be because of competition of gender nodes, as the interactive network model sustained, or because there is a facilitative priming. In the case of congruent conditions, when the distractor and the gender of the distractor and the gender of the target share the same gender, they receive more activation, and then the gender of the noun is selected, and the responses are faster. Okay, so depending of the model that we look at, the mechanisms they postulate are different. Well, or competition or facilitative. So, if the function of grammatical gender is making agreement possible, why could the gender be retrieved if there is no agreement? Because if we follow the tenets of the classical models of language production, they say that gender effects could be observed mainly when they are fulfilling or it is fulfilling the main function, right? The establishment of agreement between the elements. So what we have to do is review all the literature on grammatical gender processing with Germanic and Slavic languages, also with Roman languages, and the results that we found are the following. The answer to this question, it seems to be yes, when we consider Germanic and Slavic languages, because gender effects are only observed when participants have to use a nominal phrase, for example, but not with bare nouns. But when we look at speakers of Roman languages, the scenario is more complicated, because sometimes the effects are also are not observed with nominal phrases, but are observed with bare nouns, just the opposite. Okay, so why? With Germanic and Slavic languages, noun phrases with variable elements across gender values led to gender congruent effects. If we ask participants to name the picture using bare nouns, no effects are observed. And if we use also noun phrases, but using invariable elements across gender values, no effects are observed too. So neither. Imagine, for example, that if they are participants are speakers of German, German has nouns in German can be from masculine, feminine, or neuter, and as a function of the gender value, the form of the article is different, right? But if we ask participants to name the picture using the plural, they have to use this article, and this article not vary across gender values. So when they have to use the plural, no effects of gender are observed. This led researchers to conclude that gender is selected automatically at the lemma level, and the effects of gender that are observed in the response times of participants are due to competition between the form of the articles, between the form of the determiners. So the gender congruence effect is as a consequence of the competition that occur in the morphophonological level, not as a consequence of competition at the lemma level. Okay, this is what most researchers nowadays explain the grammatical gender retrieval. But this is what I say. They consider that gender effects are due to competition between determiners, at least when we consider participants that speak Germanic or Slavic languages. But when we look at the results with participants who speak Romance languages, the scenario, as I said before, is the opposite. When they have to name the pictures using noun phrases with variable elements across gender values, no effects of gender were observed, never in Spanish, Italian, or French. Okay. When we ask them to produce the pictures using verb nouns, some researchers found effects of gender, and others failed to find this effect. So what is happening here? Miozzo and Caramassa, in an attempt to understand what was happening with Romance and Germanic languages, formulated the late selection hypothesis. And this is an interesting hypothesis because they say that gender effects are observed in Germanic and Slavic languages because there is only one article per gender value in German, in Dutch, and in other languages. Okay, for example, in German, the masculine is there, the feminine is die, and the neuter is das, right? But in Roman languages, the scenario is more complicated because the situation is more ambiguous. For example, in Italian and in Spanish, let me explain to you what happened in Spanish. The article for the feminine, for the masculine in Spanish is el, and for the feminine is la, typically. But when the noun starts with a vowel, an accented a, then we cannot use the feminine la, we have to use the article el, and in this case el is feminine. For example, when we wanted to say el agua, the water, we cannot say la agua in order to avoid cacophony. We say el agua or el águila, the eagle, and so on. Okay, so el, the determiner el can be masculine and can be feminine, and because of that, the number of processes that occur because the gender selection phase and the response of participants are additional in Romance languages like Italian or Spanish by comparison with Germanic languages. And these processes that are in the middle and that have to be with the form of the noun, so participants have to have to process the form of the noun to decide which article they must use. Okay, this masks any interaction between gender nodes and also avoid that gender congruence effects can be observed. If Miozzo and Caramassa are right, then if we explore grammatical gender retrieval in Portuguese, we should observe grammatical gender effects because European Portuguese is a Roman language, but with a Germanic-like mapping. In fact, as far as I know, it is the only Roman language that has only one article per gender value, O for masculine and A for feminine, and there is no ambiguities here. So it happens the same as it happens with German, okay? One article per one gender value, no exceptions. So if Miozzo and Caramassa are right, and we run a picture word interference task with Portuguese participants, gender congruence effect could be observed when the participants have to use noun phrases to produce the pictures. So we tested this hypothesis using a picture word interference paradigm with noun phrases. Participants have to use an article plus a noun to name the picture. 76 native speakers of European Portuguese, and the design was a little more complicated than the other in the previous studies, but because we wanted to examine the role of transparency. So the design basically was that the gender of the target, so nouns can be feminine or masculine, also the gender congruency, like in the previous studies, gender congruent conditions and gender incongruent conditions, in which target and distractor have the same gender or not. Then we evaluated the target transparency because Portuguese is a transparent language, more transparent than German when we refer to grammatical gender, and most of the nouns that end in A are feminine and most of the nouns that end in O are masculine, and these are called transparent nouns. But there also have a lot of other nouns that end with other endings that are not related to a given value. For example, the letter E are not related with feminine or with masculine. For example, arbore is feminine and ends in A, in E, and pente, which is masculine, ends in E, but is a masculine one. So we consider this half of the nouns were transparent, half of the nouns were opaque, and we also assess the transparency congruency. That is, if target and distractor were transparent or were opaque, or one were transparent and one were opaque. Okay, so they can be from the same transparency, both opaque or both transparent, or differ in transparency. We control a lot of variables that we know that affect the lexical processing. And these were the results. We found a significant twofold interaction between gender congruency and target transparency. That is, we observed the gender congruence effect, faster responses for gender congruent pairs in comparison to gender incongruent pairs, but also restricted to the opaque nouns. And this is interesting because opaque nouns are the nouns that are present in Germanic languages, right? Because most of the nouns in these languages have no phonological cues related to gender, right? So in our case, we observe the gender congruence effect, like in Germanic languages, but restricted to opaque nouns. And then, or as a consequence, we corroborate the hypothesis of Mioso and Karamazza. And this was what happened. So faster responses when participants have to name targets that have the same gender as distractors by comparison with targets that have a different gender between target and distractor, and independent of the transparency of the words. So in Romance languages, we can also observe grammatical gender congruence effects with noun phrases when there are no experimental limitations, as it happens with Portuguese. In Spanish and Italian, we know that there are other processes that are related with the ambiguity, with the articles related to the gender values. What happened with verb nouns? Well, with verb nouns, Kubeli and collaborators found gender congruence effects, but in the other way around. So faster responses when in incongruent conditions by comparison with, or in comparison with congruent conditions. And this is difficult to explain if we follow the tenets of leading models of lexical production. Okay, even they postulate a new model in order to explain this incongruency effect, but it was a model that was very criticized by other researchers, researchers from my lab also. And Finocchiaro and collaborators and O'Rourke also replicated the studies using the same materials as Kubeli and other materials, and then failed to find gender congruence effect with verb nouns, as it happened with Germanic languages. So the picture here is not so clear, and we decided to replicate the experiment above mentioned, but asking participants to name the pictures using verb nouns instead of noun phrases, okay? So the design was exactly the same. The instruction varied because we wanted to analyze only verb nouns and no noun phrases. 18 native speakers of European Portuguese, the same control, and so on. And these are the results. So we failed to observe a grammatical gender effect. So the results are consistent with that of O'Rourke and Finocchiaro and others. But we found a significant twofold interaction between transparency congruency and target transparency. So again, the results were restricted to opaque nouns. And here what we observed is that participants were faster when the name of the target and the name of the distractor share the same transparency level. That is, here the name of the target is pincel, paintbrush in English, okay, and it's an opaque noun. And the distractor was also an opaque noun because it ends in a letter that is not related with a given gender value. In this case, when target and distractor were opaque, responses were faster in comparison to conditions in which the target is opaque, but the distractor is transparent. And this regardless of gender, okay? So it's just an effect of congruency of transparency. If both target and distractor are of the same transparency, both opaque, faster responses in comparison to incongruent conditions. So as we failed to find the gender congruency effect, and we decided, and we observed a tendency, but it was not significant. We decided to simplify the design and to replicate the experiment, but also with opaque nouns or only with transparent nouns. That is, instead of mixing transparent and opaque nouns, we decided to run two experiments, one with opaque and another one with transparent. And unfortunately, and because of COVID pandemic situation, we don't finish the data collection. So here I can only present you the results from the experiment with transparent nouns, okay? The design is the same, but more simple, only transparent nouns, and we observed the gender congruence effect. So participants were faster with gender conditions in comparison with incongruent conditions. It would be interesting to show you the results with opaque nouns, but we are collecting the data at this moment. Anyway, when we look at our question, is an agreement context necessary for Germanic languages? The question, the answer is clear. Yes, it is necessary to have an agreement context to observe the gender congruence effect, and this effect is mainly due to the form of the determiners. When we assess speakers of Roman languages, it is not necessary because sometimes gender can be observed with pronouns, and the situation is even more complicated when we look at the research that was carried out with bilinguals, because when the speakers are bilinguals, and it doesn't matter if the two languages are Germanic ones, are Germanic, or if the two languages are Romance, or if one is Germanic and the other one is Romance, the effects are always the same, gender congruency effects. So what is happening here? Why in monolingual speakers of Germanic languages, the gender effect is only observed with noun phrases, but in the other cases with monolinguals of other languages and also with bilinguals, gender effects are visible. So we decided to examine also what happens with bilinguals of European Portuguese and German in order to accumulate more data and to have a clearer picture of what was happening here with the representation of the gender. And this is a research that we carry out with the collaboration of Cristina Flores, and the results are really interesting. In this case, we ask participants to name pictures, okay, in a given language. In half of the pictures, they have to name the pictures using the European Portuguese, and in the other half of the stimuli, participants have to name the pictures using German. And what is interesting here is that translations can be from the same gender or from different gender. I mean, casa, for example, in Portuguese is feminine, right? And I don't know, Cristina, help me here. In German, casa is also feminine or not?
Jutta.
And is feminine?
Neuter.
Neuter. Okay, so it's in this case it's an incongruent condition, right? Because the gender of the two nouns across languages are heterogeneous. In one language is from a given gender value, and in the other language is from another gender value. So it's an incongruent condition. But there are nouns that have the same gender. When the nouns have the same gender across languages, these nouns are called homogeneic nouns. And when they have different gender, they are called heterogeneous nouns. If gender is processed, what we expected is that when nouns are homogeneic, responses would be faster in comparison with nouns that have heterogeneous translation, right? And this is what we observe. So these are the results regarding the production in German. These are the results regarding the production in Portuguese. Overall, responses were faster with congruent conditions, here represented in blue, in comparison with incongruent conditions, here represented in red. But the results were, the gender congruence effect was restricted to the Portuguese condition, that is when participants have to name the pictures in Portuguese, and also when there is an imbalance between the dominance of the two languages. That is, if participants are super balanced in the dominance with the two languages, the effect doesn't appear. But if there is an imbalance between the languages because they are using more Portuguese than German or more German than Portuguese, there is an imbalance, the gender congruence effect was greater. And this is represented here in this graph. So the results are really interesting. We asked why the gender congruence effect in these bilinguals appear in Portuguese and not in German. The tendency was the same, but in German we failed to observe a significant effect. And we consider that because Portuguese is a transparent language and have phonological gender cues, the level of activation of gender nodes in this language is higher in comparison to German. But let me explain better. So, considering all the data from the literature and also the data that we observe in our lab, the questions that rise are those. Why do speakers of Roman languages do not need agreement to show gender competitive or facilitative effects? Why do speakers of Germanic and Slavic languages do need agreement to show gender competitive or facilitative effects? Why do bilinguals of any language don't need agreement to show gender effects? And why gender effects interacted with transparency in our studies? So in order to account for this, for the discrepancy in the results or for the empirical data, we developed the gender acquisition and processing hypothesis. And we based our hypothesis in this concept, in the concept of transparency, okay? Because there are languages that are more transparent for gender because they have phonological cues, as it happens with Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, because most of the nouns that end in A are feminine and those that end in O are masculine, okay? There are cues that participants can pay attention to these cues in order to get the gender of the nouns, but there are other languages that are super opaque because they don't have these phonological cues related to gender. They can get the gender of the value paying attention, for example, to the form of the article, right? And this is what we think is explaining the discrepancy in data when we look at the results from from speakers of different languages. This is a continuum from more transparent to less transparent languages. And we are absolutely confident that this has consequence for the way grammatical gender is acquired and also processed. In fact, if we look at this subgraph or these words in Spanish, for instance, most of them are feminine and end in A, right? If we translated this word to Portuguese, all of them end in A and are feminine. But in French, the translations in French, as you can see, end in different letters. So the level of transparency is not so high. And if we look at the translations in German, they end in different letters, so transparency is even more, opacity is even more accentuated than in French. In French, it seems that the letter E is more associated with the feminine. Here, we cannot say nothing about the final or the endings that are associated to a given gender value, right? So gender transparency is a concept related to this issue, how visible gender is in the form of language, right? And in a given utterance like that in Portuguese, a filha alta da família recém-chegada é uma aluna educada. As you can see, the noun is feminine and the article ends, the form of the article is the same as the letter that ends the noun, also the inflection letter in the adjective, and so on. But in German, there are no phonological cues related to gender, right? So what are the repercussions of having a high degree of gender transparency? The repercussions are visible even in gender acquisition, because participants or babies or speakers of Romance languages acquire grammatical gender faster than babies or participants from Germanic languages. Even 1-2 years of difference in the acquisition of this grammatical feature. So phonological cues play a main role in gender assignment. Regular cue for gender in noun themselves. Cue for gender coincides with cues in many other agreeing elements, as we saw in the sentence above mentioned. There is a facilitation because of that on the identification and acquisition of the distributional patterns of articles and nouns. And even these babies overgeneralize the use of cues, of gender cues, when they are when they are learning to speak. They say tierra azula instead of tierra azul. Uno azoto instead of un azote, a bit in Spanish, and so on. So gender is acquired slightly early. There are a lot of research examining this issue in speakers of Roman languages, also in Germanic languages. When we look at the gender processing, participants from Roman languages use these cues in gender explicit tasks, also in gender implicit tasks, mainly language comprehension. So this led us to think that maybe what was happening is this scenario that is here represented. We take the main structure of classical models of language production, in this case the Weaver ++ model, so a conceptual level, a grammatical and syntactic level, and a morphophonological information. But we introduce a double root that explains why gender effects are observed in Romance language in a given direction, and in Germanic languages only when there are noun phrases and so on. So mainly, what we incorporated is these two roots of gender retrieval that were taken from a model formulated by or postulated by Golan and Frost in 2001. So this is the case for a speaker of Spanish, for example, or Portuguese, okay? They have to produce noun and the casa, what is a feminine noun. And when they have to produce casa, the feminine gender node is activated and accumulate activation, but also receive activation from the morphophonological level, because mesa ends in A, and A is a phonological cue for feminine. So the gender node that is located at the lemma level receive activation from the lemma level, but also from the lexical, from the information that is stored in our mind, and also from the morphophonological level because of the phonological cue. So we postulate that the degree of activation of gender nodes in Romance languages are higher in comparison with what happened in Germanic languages, because in Germanic languages, the gender nodes are only activated in the lemma level, because there are no morphophonological cues that send activation to the gender nodes, because there is no correlation between nominal endings and a given gender cue. I don't know if I have time, 10 minutes, right? I have more 10 minutes, right? Or
Yeah, please go ahead.
yeah, okay. So basically, we, according to our hypothesis, we thought, or the main postulates is that gender knows activation baseline for transparent languages is higher in comparison with gender knows activation baseline for opaque languages. Also, this would explain easily what happens with speakers of Roman languages and speakers of German languages, why gender effects are observed when participants have to say noun phrases and also verb nouns, and they speak Romance languages, but only appear with noun phrases when they speak Germanic languages, because the level of activation is higher for those that they speak transparent languages. Also explain what happens with bilingual populations, because we thought that bilinguals receive activation from the lemma level that comes from two sources, from the one language and its equivalent translation. So the degree of activation is higher in comparison to monolinguals, and this is why bilinguals, as it happens with monolingual speakers of transparent languages, encode grammatical gender and are able to show these effects in their responses. So the predictions of our hypothesis, if we are right, is that gender competitive effects, competitive or facilitative, because with our experiments we cannot say that our effects are of competition or facilitation. Well, the ones that we examine with bilinguals seems to show that the effects are of competition instead of facilitation. But the prediction is that gender competitive effects should be obtainable with verb nouns in transparent languages, especially with opaque nouns, but also with transparent nouns. Also, gender congruency effects should be warranted with an agreement context, because they receive more activation, of course, coming from the other words that go with the noun in the sentence. And that is all. Just to conclude, the gender congruence effect with verb nouns is not a robust effect, at least when we look at the results with speakers of Germanic languages. And with Roman languages, some studies seems to show the effect, others not fail to show. It's obtainable in transparent rather than Romance languages. Opaque nouns seem more prone to suffer from interference because of the function of the double root that explain the gap hypothesis. And the gender congruence effect with noun phrases may reflect both competition or facilitation between determiners and gender values. The results with bilinguals could not be interpretable if gender values didn't be selected in the lemma level, because most of the researchers that explain that the gender congruency effects that were observed with native speakers of Germanic languages were due to competence between determiners and not because competence that occur at the lemma level. But the results with bilinguals, in our point of view, refuse this hypothesis. Okay, it can be seen that the form of determiners compete for selection. This is clear, but there is also competition at the lemma level between the gender nodes. And we say that not only because the results what we found with Romance languages and also with bilinguals, but also from data that was observed with fMRI studies, in which they found activation in the B844 area. And this activation, this area, if the superior part of this area is related with the processing or the encoding of determiners, but the inferior part of this area is more related with the encoding of morphosyntactic features like gender. And in these fMRI studies conducted by Friederici and others show that there is an activation of the inferior part of this area, revealing that there is in fact competition between gender nodes in speakers of Germanic languages. So we think that the absence of evidence in reaction times cannot be taken as evidence for absence in this case, right? So in these 5 minutes, I will try to explain our approach to standardize, to create a method to evaluate how the degree of transparency of a given language, because we think that it is important to establish how transparent or how opaque is a given language when we try to examine grammatical gender retrieval. So in order to do that, we are paying attention to these 3 features. If there are gender morphemes that coincide with the morphemes in the nouns, that is, if the green elements coincide in form with the morpheme that is observed in the noun, if these elements coincide also with the gender morphemes that are observed in natural gender, and also if nouns can or have phonological cues for gender. We take the concept of ordering that in 2019, she talked about these 4 aspects that are important: frequency, perspicuity, consistency, and monofunctionality. And we try to pay attention to these 4 variables in order to assess the transparency of the language. Basically, not to give too much information about that, we thought that frequency is related with the number of nouns that ends in a Q that is related with a given value. For example, as you can see here, 85% of Portuguese nouns end in O or A, and 70% of these are transparent. That is, most of them that end in A are feminine, and most of them that end in O are masculine. So speakers of these languages can take statistical regularities associated with these nominal endings, right? The same happened with Spanish and other Romance languages. Then also the morphology related with frequency has to do with the highest proportion of nouns with natural gender and agreeing elements with gender morphemes. For example, the masculine indefinite article doesn't show the masculine morpheme O, okay? For masculine versus uma for feminine. Relative complexity. Relative complexity, as we can see here, okay, is if the phonological cues coincide with the form of the agreeing elements. So imagine for the feminine, the phonological cue is A, as I said before, and the article that go with the nouns, with the feminine nouns, also has this form A, la, una, ella, esta in pronouns, in determinants. And this is so very consistent. The scenario with masculine is more complicated because it ends in O and other letters, like here in Spanish, and the article can vary. So for the feminine, the complexity is less in comparison with the masculine. Then perspicuity, that has to do with simplicity and clearness. That is, if the more simple cues, the easier the processing and more the transparency. So, for example, at the phonological level, there are a lot of cues that are related with a given gender value, and this happens also in German. Derivational suffixes versus thematic vowels, for example. In German, there are some suffixes that are associated to a given gender value, but this cannot be compared with the phonological cues that are observed in Portuguese and in Spanish and so on. Also, if there is a matching between phonology and orthography, for example, in Spanish, the letter A is pronounced as A, and there is no ambiguity. In French, the same letter can be pronounced in different forms, and this creates a scenario of more complexity, okay? Consistency, it has to do with the ideal cue has a unique form that consistently represents a particular gender value. So if there are less cues associated to a given value, the consistency is higher. I gave here some examples. Also the monofunctionality, for example, if a given cue is related to a given function or two different functions, creating more ambiguity situations. So what we try to do here with this proposal, we are working on that, is carry out a systematical assessment of the degree of gender transparency of languages in order that researchers can use this tool to assess the degree of transparency. We also think that it's important we use electroencephalographic measures to study the time course of lexical assets, having gender into consideration, because we know that sometimes observing effects at the behavioral level is not so easy when we are looking at the grammatical gender. It is important also to analyze individual differences in the gender congruency effect. From our data, we consistently saw that some participants always show a congruent effect, a congruency effect, but others sometimes show a congruency, other times incongruency. So it is important to assess what is happening with individual differences. Also, the gender congruence effect, it is important to examine bilinguals from early versus late populations that acquire the languages early in life or late, using also ITRI techniques and pay attention to the transparency of the languages, of course, because we are very confident that the transparency is the feature that are determine the way that grammatical gender is represented in the mind and also processed. And thank you so much. I would like to end this presentation saying thanks to my colleagues, Cristina Flores from the University of Minho and Karina, also my colleagues from the University of Santiago de Compostela, and especially to my student of doctorate, that is Ana Rita Saleite, and I think that all the credits are for her, because this what I present here is the results of her PhD. She defended her PhD in December, so nowadays she is a doctorate and she's working with us, with Cristina, with me, and other colleagues. So thank you so much, and okay, let me answer your questions.